All right, we are back in the Fireside PM podcast, and I have a repeat visitor, Brian Goffman. We go back, and you were on before, and we were talking about all kinds of research you were doing. And this time, we're going to talk about it's a twofer. We're going to talk about some hard career lessons learned over our various careers. Like you'll share some, I'll share some. And then we're going to get into what we think is the future of product management in an AI world. Like, does the world even need PMs anymore? What will that look like? I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on that. I haven't developed a strong point of view yet on that one, but I'm sure it'll be a fun conversation. So welcome back to the show, Brian.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be here. Super excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, man. For those who didn't watch the first one, maybe we could just start with a little bit of your background and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, I mean, the quick background is I've been working in tech a little longer than you have, but not that much longer. But I have been in part of Web 1.0, 2.0. Now, I guess you could call it 3.0 in AI.
Mm-hmm.
Have done several startups or been part of several startups, including Smart Things, which was acquired by Samsung. And earlier than that, LinkedIn, which of course is Microsoft to some extent, and also was CEO and co-founder of a company I started with a partner doing marketing automation software, and that's now Marketo, became Adobe. I was a VC earlier in my career at a firm called Austin Ventures, and most recently I've been at McKinsey, where I've been helping lead what practice called software excellence, which means working with engineers and product managers across different industries. So I've had a view of a bunch of different angles of product management and building software with different industries. So I'm happy to share all of that.
Love it. Well, let's so we'll go back down memory lane for both of us. I was thinking three kind of periods. One would be super early advice, like right out of undergrad. Then maybe coming out of business school or grad school. And then maybe the third one is like our first hard lessons learned in like a leadership role where we were managing a team and responsible for other people. You want to go first on a hard lesson learned as a young whippersnapper out of undergrad?
Yeah, it's funny when you frame it as hard lessons learned, because I think the lessons don't stop. And the context changes it. And I think somebody, once said, like, make new mistakes every day.
Yeah.
So I try to not repeat the same mistake, but there's always going to be something you go, wow, why didn't I know that last time? It's just the volume of things you don't know in the beginning is the largest. So, look, I think that's a good way to frame it. So right out of college or right out of graduate school, I think there's kind of mid-career where you're managing maybe a small team, and then there's the large scale team, maybe, more almost like a general manager kind of a view of a product leader. And so when you're first coming out of school, now I didn't personally do this. I came out of school and joined McKinsey, then I went to HBS, and then I was, in a product management role after business school and consulting. Which was probably more the traditional role back in the Web 1.0, even 2.0 phase of software. And you saw a lot of people with that profile. If you look at people, who are had that experience, that's typically what they did. And so I think a lot of those people coming into their product roles had a business background and potentially a technical background as an undergrad, but it wasn't as common then to go from, say, a computer science background into product management. It was more of a business role or maybe biz ops or something. Then you eventually migrated into product. I think today there are so many of these great programs you can join at Google or at Facebook or even across industries that are bringing people right out of college, and then they put you in some kind of rotation or some kind of program that gives you the basics. And those are phenomenal programs. And that has, in effect, it's replaced that consulting experience that a lot of people chased, earlier. So one decision I would say people make that I think is a kind of lesson learned that I'll say applies more today than maybe back then is, should you go into product management, or should you go into consulting and then into product management, or should you go into engineering and then into product management? Now, a lot of people have asked me this question, maybe partly because I've been in consulting and I've also been in PM. And what I tell people, which is true today, but maybe wasn't as true before, is go into product management. Like if you want to be, when I was a rower in college, and my coach used to always say, well, the best way to learn to row is to row. And so I think if you want to be a product manager and you can get that opportunity, go for that opportunity. And that's a lesson learned for a lot of folks, not as much me, because I had that path and it was easier to do. But today, if you go into consulting, or you go into banking, or you go into, some other role, which when you're coming out of college looks like they're kind of all the same, they're equal. And then you try to go into product management, it's actually a harder road than a lot of people realize. That doesn't mean the skills aren't transferable. That doesn't mean that you're not going to be a better PM in the long term, because I actually would argue a lot of the ex-consultants and others make great product managers. But the industry is structured in a way that you can go into that APM program, and it's probably a smoother path into product management.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, I think years ago, if we go way back, people that went into tech in the 90s, like, they weren't like, that wasn't the plum assignment everybody was fighting for before the dot-com rush. And so it was very common to go into a McKinsey or a Bain or a BCG or a Goldman or, JP Morgan or whatever. And then, the world was your oyster. You were kind of like, on the MVP team, and, people would try and be delighted to have you.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think what changed is then two things. Like, one, tech jobs became like considered not just like the nerdy jobs, but like just great, amazing jobs. And then secondly, to your point, they developed these kind of feeder programs where they would just recruit top people right out of undergrad and give them great experiences.
Right. I mean, if you go back a little earlier than you and me, and you talk to the people who went to Microsoft in the 80s,
Mm-hmm.
that was out of Harvard or Stanford. That was very rare.
Yeah.
There just were not that many jobs, and there weren't that many people who did it, partially, as you said, because the compensation and the prestige wasn't there.
Yeah.
It wasn't like today where you go and you're going to make that. And I think that's what's confused a lot of, graduates, undergrads coming out, because the salaries are actually pretty comparable if you go to all these different places.
Yeah.
That they do diverge over time, and the opportunities and what happens in your career diverges. But one lesson I would say is, when you're looking at this and you aren't doing it, you don't realize how different your day-to-day is going to be when you're a product manager or an engineer or a consultant or doctor or whatever you choose to, if you're a smart person and you can mold yourself in different directions. And I see a lot of people who don't have a particular passion yet. What I encourage them to do is to pick the best choice they can and see how it fits. And if it doesn't fit, change. But as opposed to making like 5 steps, figuring out how that's going to get you to what you really want.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the other thing that happened was maybe the cachet today of being a former McKinsey analyst, like from a few years ago, is not the same as being a McKinsey analyst in the 90s, where it was like joining the Olympic team kind of thing. Like, so I think that's part of, and that kind of like becomes like a reinforcing thing. Now, here's one thing I would say is I actually think if someone were asking me, I might advocate for joining a really well-led early or even mid to late stage startup, just a startup as a PM versus joining it as an APM at a, gigantic company. And part of the reason I'd advocate for that is if all you've done is work at the big company, you don't have the kind of experience trying to like fight for survival the way a startup does. And that hones some skills that are helpful as a 0 to 1 PM. Because at some point, if you say, oh no, my whole career, I'm always going to want to work on the 100 million users and above. Okay, fine. Then go do the APM program and that'll be amazing. But if you want to, eventually see yourself leading like a high growth company, there's a trade-off with some of the bigger companies.
Well, I think that's the other dimension. And, we both love 2x2s, but I think the other dimension of this not only is PM, non-PM, but it's small company, large company. And my first company I joined as a product leader was a startup. We had 30 people, and it was trial by fire. Like you had, and it was a high profile thing in that era. We raised not by today's standards, but relatively a lot of money. We're in the Wall Street Journal multiple times, so it was a very intense experience, but I wouldn't have traded it for anything, even though the outcome in the end, didn't make everybody a whole lot of money. It led to the next thing, which did. So those experiences, you have nowhere to hide. So if you plan to, now the thing is, your parents will not understand what you're doing. They may have never heard of the company. It's hard to explain to your friends. You're bragging about, oh, I work at Meta, or I'm working on, this thing that you've heard of. And so that's the downside. And that takes a lot of fortitude. But I think there's there's two schools of thought on this. And that is, and this, I'm making a little bit of a judgment here around age, but if you're in your 20s, should you take the more certain path and just accumulate experience before you take risk? Or should you take the risk and go ahead and roll the dice? And then if it doesn't work out, then you go maybe to the less riskier place. I think a lot of people found out in 22, 23 with the layoffs that happened in big tech, that those jobs were not as safe as people thought. And a lot of the people who did get let go were the junior people. A lot of the junior people who had been hired in mass got let go. So, and then it wasn't performance related. It was just the fact that they were the last in. So I think I'm with you. I would find a quality startup. Now, then you have to say, well, how do you measure quality? And when there's one person with an idea, or even a Y Combinator has approved you, does that mean quality? You have to look at the heuristics to figure out what quality is. And at this point in my career, one other lesson learned is I don't think you have to go down with the ship. Like, I'm a very loyal person in my career, in my relationships, in just generally. And my first startup was not going well, and I knew it. And I was not the CEO. And I stayed too long. So the other thing is like, well, what do you do if it's not going well? Do you double down and work harder, or do you eventually give up? And when do you give up? And I think moving on is a skill in Silicon Valley. And unfortunately it plays out into people doing, these endless 2-year stints, which can start to look really bad on your resume if you do too many of them. So everyone wants to land in LinkedIn or in the next Google or OpenAI of today. That's very unlikely. But if you're not in that and it's going down, meaning like the thing is sinking, you're running out of money, it's probably not worth sticking around.
Yeah. I think startup employees should think of themselves as investors. And every year you're basically kind of effectively writing a check into that company, because you could be earning more probably elsewhere, and you have opportunity costs. And so you have to ask yourself, like, is it worth it for me to stay another year? And I think earlier in my career I was like, well, you've just got to do a minimum of 3 to 4 years, or you're going to look like a job hopper. And I've seen extremes where I've seen some resumes where people are at like 3 or 4 companies in 4 years kind of thing, that's a little extreme. But if you're in your 20s, you're at one or two companies that you stay too long, that's a decade of investment, basically. My argument would be like, look, you do give them 2 years, and then they have to convince you that it's worth it to stay, and that there's a path there,
no, I agree with you on the framework. You really are an investor, and you're investing things something you can't get back. Like, I can invest in a startup now, and if I lose my money, I lose my money. It doesn't change my life. But if I invest 2, 3, 5 years of my life, I never get that back. Yeah. And so I value time at this point, particularly more than I value money as an investment currency. So again, I think it's a balance where you have to weigh the costs and don't do it every day. But on a periodic basis, you say, is this going to work out? What are the odds? And and this is true whether you're taking the job or you're doing that review, what not only the upside, like, again, I'm a very optimistic person, so I tend to see all the amazing things that can happen. But if you're living in Silicon Valley in a venture-backed world, most of the companies are not going to make it. And they're certainly not going to make it if you're not a founder in terms of economic return. I think related to that, you also have to think, if this doesn't work out, meaning this company doesn't return capital and collapses, will I still be feeling like it was the right thing? And meaning the stock is worth nothing. All you made was the cash you got paid, and the experience you got was the experience you got. How do you feel about that? And play that scenario out. That's another thing you can do, just to think about the upside and the downside. And if you feel good about that risk and you're in your 20s and you want to roll the dice, that is the absolute right decision.
Yeah, totally agree. In fact, if I went back in time to my 20s and I said, okay, yeah, I want to start working at startups, I would probably have in my head, I may need to work at 3 to 4 over this decade. I might get lucky and work at 1 and ride the rocket ship, past IPO. But there's a good chance I'm going to have to place a lot of bets here and go in with that mentality. Because if you stay with the ship knowing that it's not going anywhere and you stretch it out 6, 7 years, you kind of pay all the costs that the founders had to, but you don't have nearly as much upside as the founder. So it's not really structured for you to, spend a decade at a company that's not going, in the right places.
Well, the other thing is, you might get lucky financially in your 20s, but you really are maximizing your learning.
Yes.
And so if your learning is capping off, and this again, like we talk about lessons learned, I didn't think of it this way. I was trying to accumulate not just money, but credentials also and experience. And it was a different framework. But I think today, think about it as learning. And if your learning is plateauing and it's just becoming a grind, that startup is probably not for you. Last thing I'll say on this choice of big company, small company, I've had a lot of exposure at McKinsey to private equity and private equity software. And people are surprised at how much of the software industry is owned by private equity. And in Silicon Valley, that doesn't get as much of the headlines, but a lot of these are great companies. There's also software in places like automotive. And that applies certainly in self-driving cars, which are a little more like venture-backed companies, but a lot of them are owned by big auto companies, or partially. That also applies to medical devices or aerospace and defense. And so there's a lot of industries that need innovation that historically were not very exciting from a career point of view. But now there's so much opportunity opening up, not only for learning and for innovation, but also for wealth creation, that you kind of got to take a bigger aperture than the Magnificent Seven when you're thinking about your career in your 20s.
I love it. All right, so I think our advice for early 20s people is strongly consider startups and be strategic about which ones and how long you stay at one versus another. but also consider, the top tier APM programs, because they are fantastic. And, I've seen people start with the APMs at the big company and then they go to a startup as an more experienced PM. Like that's the fine route as well. So awesome. Should we jump to like maybe postgraduate school? Like now you're a little more experienced and a little working a little further down the career. Any hard lessons that come to mind?
Well, I think so. Number one on this front is now at this point, if you're, I don't want to put an age on it, but you've been in your career for 5 to 10 years. You are taking your experiences with you. You do not exist in a vacuum now. Mm-hmm. So two things happen. One, the industry sees you in the role you're in. So if you're a product manager and you're a consumer person, you may want to do B2B, but the industry is going to see you as a consumer product manager or vice versa. And so it's hard to, you got these cement shoes that you have to kind of get rid of, even though you can do another job. When you move from one company to another, most people are going to want to hire you to do what you already do. And that only gets more entrenched as you build up more experience over time, especially if it's very consistent. So that's good because you build up expertise, but it may be boring because you're starting to say, well, I already know this. I've already done this. I want to do something else. But the best way to do something else is most of the time within one company where you've already got a track record and they trust you. It's hard to do that as you move across companies, unless you're going to start your own company, in which case you can do anything you want because it's up to you. But I think that's something that certainly I learned over time was the benefit and the sort of a weight of experience, which starts to build your track record, your LinkedIn profile. Related to that, and we used to call this at LinkedIn, relationships matter. That's one of the values at LinkedIn. And most of the jobs you're going to get from there are going to be either based on people you know, or you're going to get involved and then they're going to find out you know or don't know. And the bigger the job, the more the relationships matter. It's very rare, I think, that someone out of the blue who has no relationships gets the job. It's almost always somebody connected in, and it takes a village to make that happen. So, and I think that applies also when you start to think about how you're going to build your team. If you come into a job where there's 5 open recs and you're building a team and you have to go out and interview completely de novo and you know no one you can recruit, that's a problem. You should have people in mind when you take the job of who your first few calls are going to be. And because those are also the people who are most likely to fit, want to work for you, quickly, because you don't have a lot of time. You might have 6 months to put that organization together, even a small one. And so those are all tough lessons that I've learned. We can talk about more, but I think those are at least 3.
Those are great ones. I mean, I'll build on the first one, and then we'll shift gears to hard lessons as a organizational leader, and then we'll talk about the future of the product management profession. My quick build on your point around the cement shoes or the specialization. In my experience, I'm a liberal arts guy, so I love learning new industries like every few years. And I think initially I unintentionally made this trade-off, but now I continue to do it, which is I realize had I stayed in, let's say, ad tech, like I was in 2006 to 2012, really, it'd be a very easy argument to take on more senior roles earlier in my career in that space. But I think for me, the trade-off was, but I don't think I would be having as much fun as learning a new industry and, learning new kinds of problems. And so I'm okay with that, taking on the role of a generalist, like a first principles product thinker. And I realize that might limit my options down the road. but like I'm fine with that. But people should be aware that that is a trade-off that they're making. And if they wanted to optimize for like time to VP, like I think specialization by your 30s makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame it. If you're in that middle zone where you're director and you stay in that vector, whatever it is, ad tech, consumer media, B2B, infrastructure, database, whatever you choose, you will have probably a higher trajectory staying in that zone than if you decide to jump over and change. But as a product leader, you have to be passionate about your product.
Yes.
So if you're not passionate, you may say, oh, I'll make more money, I'll have a bigger job, but I'm going to be miserable, and you're not actually going to succeed. So I think in theory, but there are certainly career paths that look that way, and those are the people. If you find the thing you're passionate about, you're excited, and also you can continue in that track. But if you're more of a generalist, I think you can take on all of these different sectors and still be successful.
All right, let's talk about hard lessons learned, maybe leading like medium to larger size teams or small orgs. What comes to mind for you, Brian?
So I think the job changes quite a bit when you go from having certainly a team you directly lead to, kind of like an IC, and then you have a team, to having you're managing managers or even managing teams of managers. Because now you've got geographies spread around, you have people who are not interacting with you day to day. And the communicate. So one of the first things that changes is communication. At least for me, the way I communicated had to change. I had to be able to articulate a vision to much larger sets of people, and also to a lot more stakeholders. When you're a PM, you might be meeting one-on-one with your peer in engineering, or your PM, or your, peer in customer support or marketing. Now, all of a sudden, you're leading a team and you're interacting with other people who lead teams. And so you're presenting to teams of teams. Maybe there's if it's B2B, it's a sales kickoff. You've got to get the sales team excited. So you're wearing all these different hats, communicating with a lot of different audiences. And what I've seen is that, it took me a while to learn this, you have to be able to, I'm going to use the word manipulate, but that sounds a little bad. But I think that's what it is a little bit, is manipulate your persona to the audience that you're presenting to. If you're doing a one-on-one versus if you're doing a sales kickoff versus if you're talking to a group of engineers, you have to be able to know your audience and talk to your audience in a way that they will hear you and you can be understood. That's
more
one
like
lesson.
maybe adapt and tune your communication style. And
yeah. And the people who are really good at that level are able to go from one context to another and perform phenomenally well. And they prepare for it. They really prepare. I think the second thing is the relationships become even more important, and the recruiting, your ability to build and lead a team. Now you're leading senior people. So they know what they're doing. A lot of these people are really good. So you need to be able to demonstrate you should be their boss. Otherwise, why are you there? You're not, and because your organizational power only goes so far. Even if you're the CEO, if you're recruiting great people, hopefully they're better than you, certainly at the function they're doing. And so you have to continue to think about, why am I even here to help them? And you have to help their career accelerate, or they won't stick around. And they won't perform at their best. So a lot of the job also becomes much more about people management, people performance management, and also when people aren't working out, helping them turn it around, or deciding that it's not working out and they should go do something else, which is probably better for them and for you. And those are really hard decisions. I think there's no one, I would say there's almost no one who's had a significant management role and not said, I wish I had let that person go sooner. Like everyone waits too long. Yeah. Because of so that's a lesson that I've learned. And I think just about everyone else has as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking the same thing. Like, I kind of feel like as you certainly as you take on broader roles and you're managing teams and teams of teams, your value add is the ability to make the hard 5149 calls and to make them in a timely way and to be very comfortable having uncomfortable conversations, including personnel ones, as well as sunsetting projects, as well as saying, hey, this is not working the way we need it to. And I think a lot of us, I can only speak for myself. When I was growing up and earlier in my career, I think I was a pleaser. And so as a pleaser, like, you don't want to upset people that work for you because you hired them and they are great. But if things need to be changed, like, I think earlier in my career, I would avoid those conflicts and just kind of talk around it or, hint that things needed to be better. And over the years, I think I've learned whether it's a people issue or a project issue, it's always better to address it up front. It's actually kinder and more helpful to the individual or the team than kind of beating around the bush. Or
well, there's two themes you're highlighting. One is it takes a lot more repeating than you realize.
Yes.
Right. So you have to, because you're dealing with more people, they're more spread out. They're not with you all the time. So if you have a vision you're trying to communicate, or a direction you're trying to communicate, or change you want to make, you have to actually say it so many times. It becomes just almost, absurd, but to you, but a lot of people have not heard it. And so that, and it also becomes a little bit strange when you start hearing people saying back what you have been communicating, then you know that the message has landed. And then, like you said, you have to do it in a very timely way. You have to realize that the further you get up in the pyramid, the more your delays reverberate through the organization. So if you're sitting on something for a few weeks, you've got a lot of people sitting around waiting. What does Tom think? What's Tom going to do? And and that has really meaningful cost.
Totally.
And that applies to responding to emails, Slack messages, and day-to-day things, but it means like a hiring decision or a financing decision or a product launch, or no go. All these decisions kind of reverberate at the higher you are and the bigger the company.
Yeah. One last thing I'll add before we jump into what you think, if anything, the product management profession how it will change with AI. I would also add on the leadership comm side. One, we talked about, like, sometimes people can take too long to kind of make a call or have a hard conversation. The other thing is the opposite, where the leader is like spitballing in front of a group, different ideas, and they interpret that as like, oh, well, Brian said that, we're going to go all in on Gen AI and we should just drop everything. And meanwhile, you were just like, it's a thought exercise, we're brainstorming, whatever. So that's like kind of being aware of the megaphone you have by fact that, like, you are a humble person. You think of yourself as one of the team, but that you do have a title and there's an org chart for a reason. And people will interpret what you say in a different way than they did, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. And you said lessons learned. So this was a hard lesson, and I've seen other people learn it in front of me. They'll send out a random email of like, oh, look what so-and-so is doing, or look at that company, they launched it. And then all of a sudden a project gets spun up that they don't even know about to do something about that. What I've seen people do is tag their emails in a color code or, some kind of 3 levels of importance of like, hey, this is just FYI, or this is something you need to act on, or like, this is really urgent. We need to do something. And as a leader, particularly a product leader, you have this large scale of influence and you have to be thoughtful about how you're communicating without confusing people. Because the more you speak out loud, the more you will confuse people if they're not really listening closely, and most of the time they're not.
All right, Brian, let's talk a little bit about this wonderful profession, is this going to be, will PMs be unrecognizable 5 years from now? Like what do you think is going to happen to the profession, the function, the job?
So I think that this is a very deep topic. We could spend a whole session on it. I think the product management function is changing before our eyes. And I think it's partially driven by AI. It's partially just driven by the evolution of our entire industry. But the reason the AI component of it is affecting PM is that more and more skills are possible through the tools that are becoming available. It's also true that things that used to take a day can now be done in an hour, just so things can be done faster. When you really add it up and you look at the product development lifecycle, in the first phase, there's a lot more ability to generate ideas. In phase 2, there's a lot more ability to build prototypes and launch experiments. And in phase 3, there's a lot more ability to build things faster through engineering. And so given all those combination of things, now you have a PM who's sitting at this in a machine that's moving faster and faster and running more and more experiments. And the expectation is now that you can do design because you have the software tools. You can turn a paper napkin into JavaScript. You can do some level of coding to at least create a prototype, if not a fully working, early product, even if you're not a professional engineer. And you kind of see the more, munging of these different previously separate functions and in a much higher paced environment. So I think the expectations of PMs is going up and the job is getting broader. That doesn't mean it's going to go away, but it does mean it's going to change. I've heard all kinds of speculation. I've heard people say, oh, in the future, there'll be one PM for every 100 engineers instead of one for every 8, or some cases. When I was at Microsoft, there was one PM for every 3 engineers.
Yes.
Literally 3 to 1.
Yeah.
And people wrote PRDs and they were, 100 pages long and they were all written in advance. And then you threw it over the wall to engineering and they built it and we iterated slowly. I mean, if you compare that world to today, I think you compare today to 5 years from now, and it will be an equal jump in speed and expectation and potentially in terms of and leverage in the PM role.
Yeah, I totally agree in the direction. Like the ratio is definitely going to be more engineers to PM. I wonder how that works because the engineers 10 years from now or 5 years from now are going to be way more productive than they are today. So they're going to be able to push through way more roadmap per quarter than they used to. So you could argue, well, wouldn't that kind of balance out? And therefore you could stick with the 1 to 10 ratio because 1 PM to 10 engineers today will be like 1 to 30 just because those engineers are going to be 3 times as effective. So I don't know how that's going to pan out, but I will say I've been doing some consulting projects this year and I am able to put together analyses and recommendations and do customer research solo that I used to need a team to do. And not only am I doing it with less people, it's happening faster. And I actually think I'm able to tie all the pieces together in my head better than if I just carve it out and have like 4 different pieces done by different people. And then I have to do this big reconciliation process. So I think my sense is that the number of PMs that we're going to need is going to be considerably less. And maybe the other thing I would add is that the PMs that we do have, I think they're going to need a much bigger range. And this is where their ability to be great problem solvers and synthesizers and kind of strategists and ideators, like that's probably going to be at an even greater premium than let's say 5-10 years ago, which was like sometimes the best PMs were former engineers who were really close to the code and the technology. I'm not sure, like that, of course, will still be a feather in people's caps. But I don't think it's going to be as crucial because I can just ask ChatGPT, like, oh, well, what do you think of this architecture? What do you think of this design doc? And is this a reasonable estimate? And those are things that sometimes like you needed like a more technical background for.
I'll push back on you in one area. I mean, disagree with you.
Yeah,
I don't think the world will need fewer PMs. Whatever the ratio is, if it's 1 to 5, it's certainly not going to be 1 to 3. It may not be 1 to 100, but there's going to be more code getting written. There's going to be more products getting created. The velocity and experiment, parts because of experimentation, but also just the amount of software that's getting created in the world is going to go up. And so I think there will be more need for PMs. Now, not all those PMs will be working at Meta or Google. A lot of them will be working at Ford or American Express or Deere. And those companies will need product managers. And that's what you see in the industry is that a lot of industries are adopting a tech type of operating model. And so PMs are broadening across industries and also across geographies. But to your point about like what the expectations are, I totally agree. But it's going up for engineers as well. It's going up for designers. It's going up for everyone involved to do more. And that will continue. So the output will keep going up. But I think the ratio, the number of jobs, I'm pretty bullish. Now, the question on what you said about technical skills versus business skills, I think there's just different archetypes of PMs. And this is another topic we could cover probably on a podcast. There are some that are going to be at a place like AWS or Google Cloud where they are going to be very technical because the product is very technical. There are other PMs who are going to be at, much more consumer facing application, a Snapchat client or, mobile app. That may not be as technical a person. They have to be able to work with engineering and know what's going on, but I don't think it's the product itself is inherently not that technical. So there's a lot of different archetypes. It also depends on the org structure. Like in Microsoft, things tend to get built by large teams. There's not as much decision making as you go down in the org about what you're going to launch. The decisions get more granular. Whereas in some places you're somewhat like at Amazon running a 2-pizza team, almost like a general manager. That requires a pretty broad set of skills. So those are the two dimensions I would think about is the org structure, the org model, and also the type of product. But net, there's going to be more PMs, and the job is going to continue to be very interesting.
Yeah. So I will agree with you that there is a scenario where there are certainly more PMs. I think what you're pointing out, which I agree with, is the share of them that are working in tech first giant corporations will move to PMs at like torso and tail companies. Part of it is because non-technical or corporations will become more innovation focused, technology focused. I also think there's a world where there's going to be a lot more profitable, smaller software companies that are doing great work. And we may not have these like giant, gargantuan kind of FANG companies. And then those FANG companies, I don't think are going to need as many people as they assume they would have because of productivity improvements and also investor expectations. So yeah, it's definitely like okay, let's wrap with this, Brian. Because we'll have to come back to this episode 5 years from now. If you had to make 2 or 3 predictions about what the PM profession / industry will look like, what would be like 1 or 2 that we can go back and look and see how we got it right or wrong?
Well, now this is being recorded, so I've got to be bold but conservative about being right. The first thing I think it's clear the job is going to broaden, meaning the expectations are you're a designer, you're a strategist, you're a business leader, you're an engineer, you're a technologist. All of those skills are going to be needed to be a 5-tool player, like truly the upper quartile capable PM. Now, that doesn't mean some PMs won't be 1 or 2 of those things, But to be the really great one and rise to the top of the profession, I think it's going to take that. I think the second thing is that the people skills are going to matter more and more. The first phase of the web, to some extent, commoditized knowledge. All of us can go on Google and find out just about any fact. May not be the accurate fact, but eventually we'll find the accurate fact. So memorizing facts, when you think about what made a smart person 100 years ago, has kind of become a commodity. I think increasingly that's going to happen with expertise. So what's left? Well, relationships, the ability to manage people, the ability to persuade people, the ability to connect that broadly, and have vision, have a vision that's not just what you can get from ChatGPT. So I think that all those softer skills are going to actually become more important and differentiate the people who, because everyone now can go on ChatGPT, as you said, and write a document and do things that used to be really hard. I mean, being able to write is a skill. It's clearly important. In some companies, you succeed by writing documents, like at Amazon. But now more and more people are going to be able to write better documents. So less differentiation. But I do think clarity of thinking is going to continue to be a critical skill. So I would say those two things are two things I can point out as pretty high certainty.
Yeah, I love it. I can't wait till we look back on this in 2029, and I'll give two as well. I'll put myself out there as well. I appreciate you playing along, Ryan. I think one thing that I've noticed that ChatGPT and its alternatives are not that good about is I don't think they have great judgment. I think they can make an argument for anything. Like whenever this year I was thinking about starting a company and I would ask it like, hey, I'm thinking about this idea. It would almost always say, that's a great idea. Here are the pros and cons. Here's how it would work. And here's some challenges. But it wouldn't then if I'd say, okay, well, of the last three, like which one do you think is better? It was not, I felt like it wasn't very effective. So I do think 5 years from now, there will be a high premium paid for humans who can exercise great judgment using, like they'll take the AI guidance as far as it can go. And then when they need to make the 5149 call or they need to place a bet, the humans that are really good at that, I guess in Amazon parlance, like being right a lot or often or something, like that's going to be crucial. And then I'll also concur with you that the soft skills of building human alignment to get everyone to agree on a path forward when everyone will have been informed up to some level by AI. And then an organization is going to need to make a decision. Like the PMs that can bring that together. And that's always been valued. But I think it will be one of like the other things that PMs do will still be important, but a lot of that will be done or accelerated by AI. And so I think of those two things, like if you're a PM that has great judgment, that you're right often on the hard calls, and you're able to get people to agree and to get buy-in in complex organizations cross-functionally, like I would imagine you'll be paid a very high premium and be in high demand.
Yeah. There is a lot of value in Silicon Valley to being right. Yes. You may be lucky, but if you're right, nobody knows.
That's right. For sure.
So I think that's going to matter a lot. As you said, Amazon, that's one of their values is making those bold bets and also being right.
Yeah.
The one thing I'd add is computers are incredible at objective seeking, but somebody's got to set the objective. Now, there's a lot of debate in the future in AI whether the computers will make their own objectives, and that's when they become somewhat sentient and we may lose control. But we're not there, and that may not ever happen. Until that happens, we set the objectives. And so the people who are really good at creating those objectives and understanding how to tweak them and point them in the right direction, those are going to be really important jobs.
Yeah, setting great objectives for AI is almost like a new management skill, because you got to think of AI as like your direct report. How can I bring out the best in this team member? How can I bring out the best in this AI, like to get what I need done? And yeah, I totally agree. Like the ability to, I guess we would call it prompt engineering, but it really is like coaching and managing the AI to help you accomplish your goals. So
absolutely.
Yeah, good stuff, Brian. Anything else you want to share, or how can people kind of keep track of your latest thoughts on things and follow you?
So I post most of what I'm thinking either on X or LinkedIn, but LinkedIn is the place to be.
Yeah. Oh, you're still on X.
Very close to my heart. But I have not given up on X.
I'm taking a little sabbatical from X after early this month. I'm trying out Blue Sky. Blue Sky is kind of fun. Have you played around with that a little bit?
I have not, but
it reminds me of like Twitter 10 years ago. Like it's still a little more, it's a different vibe, but I was so glad to have you back on, and look forward to future conversations, Brian.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Tom. Okay.
Bye.